I'll write a completely new story applying the success formula analyzed above. Let me first check the use names list to ensure all new characters are unique. The use names to avoid: Gloria, Marcus, Destiny, Amara, Eleanor, Celeste, Daniel, Nora, Sylvia, Connie, Raymond, Patrick, Kevin, Shara, Diane, Loretta, Beverly, Patricia, Phyllis, Winifred, Leonard, Janelle, Brent, Harriet Monroe, Tamara, Franklin, Opal, Margaret, Theodore, Caroline, Marjorie Holloway, Bennett, Carl, Hollis Truebridge, Vivian, Derek, Cassie, Ruthann, Iris, Caleb, Renata, Josephine, Dorothea, Lynette, Garrett, Barbara, Audrey, Nathan, Kristen, Vera, Edna, Lorraine, Evelyn, Philip, Tanya, Roberta, Lorraine, Millicent, Sandra, Paulette Vickers, June, Claudette, Trent, Warren, Cecile, Miles, Adrian, Betty. New names chosen: Lucille, narrator/mother, Dwayne, son, Simone, daughter-in-law, Curtis, deceased husband. The night my son called me at 2 in the morning, I was already awake. I'd been sitting in the kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the backyard through the sliding glass door. The motion light had clicked on, probably a raccoon again, and I was just sitting there in my robe, not thinking about anything in particular. 63 years on this earth, and I still couldn't sleep past 3 most nights. Curtis used to say I had too much engine for one body. He said it like it was a compliment. I believed him every time. So when my phone lit up on the counter and I saw my son's name, my first thought wasn't worry. It was annoyance, because by that point, a call from my son after midnight almost always meant one thing: he needed something. I picked up on the third ring. "Mom." His voice was tight, clicked, the way it got when he was performing urgency. I'd learned to tell the difference between his real panic and his manufactured panic somewhere around the time he was 15 and faking stomach aches to get out of algebra tests. "Dwayne." It's 2 in the morning. I know. Listen, Simone and I are at the Harborview Grand and there's a situation. The Harborview Grand. I knew that hotel. It's at right on the water downtown, $280 a night for their cheapest room. And that was before you got into the spa packages and the room service and whatever else my daughter-in-law considered a basic human necessity. "What kind of situation?" I said. Not a question. More like a warning. The card got declined. They're saying we owe for the last 2 nights plus tonight, and if we don't pay by morning checkout, they're going to— "Mom!" They said they'd involve the police. Something about the minibar charges and the incidentals. It's $11,000. I set down my tea. $11,000. I want you to understand something about that number. Not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. My late husband Curtis worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the county. We were not wealthy people. We were careful people. We bought this house in 1987 for $112,000, and we paid it off in 2009, and we threw a small party in the backyard with ribs and sweet tea, and my sister Rosalie brought a chocolate cake. That was what we celebrated. Not vacations at luxury hotels, not minibar charges. The absence of debt, the presence of something that was truly ours. So when my son said $11,000 like it was a parking ticket, something shifted in me, something that had been shifting, slowly, for about 2 years. "Call your wife's parents," I said. Silence. "Mom." "Dwayne." "You heard me. Her parents don't have that kind of money on short notice, you know that." "Then call the front desk and work out a payment plan. That's what adults do." "Lucille." He only used my name when he was trying to make me feel like I was being unreasonable. My own son, using my first name like a weapon. "We need help. You have the money. This is an emergency. Good night, Dwayne." I hung up. Then I turned off the ringer, finished my tea, and went back to bed. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the 2 years that came before that phone call. My son got married 18 months after his father died. I want to be careful here because I don't think grief excuses everything. But I also think grief makes you stupid in ways you don't recognize until much later. Dwayne was 34 when Curtis passed, And I think losing his father broke something loose in him that he filled back up with whatever Simone told him to fill it with. She had an answer for everything. She always had an answer for everything. She always had an answer for everything. I met her 4 times before the wedding. 4 times in 14 months. She was pretty in a careful way, the kind of pretty that takes a lot of money to maintain, and she laughed at all the right moments and complimented my cooking exactly once, and then never mentioned food again. My sister Rosalie pulled me aside at the engagement dinner and said, "Lucille, that woman looked at your house like she was taking inventory." I told Rosalie she was being dramatic. I should have listened to Rosalie. They got married in September at a venue outside the city. I won't say how much I contributed to that wedding, except to tell you it was more than I should have and less than Simone wanted. She wore a dress that cost $6,000. I know because she told me. At the reception, while I was eating a piece of chicken, she walked up to my table and said, "Did you know this dress is $6,000? My mother almost fainted when she saw the price tag, and she laughed like it was a funny story about someone else's money." 3 weeks after the honeymoon, they asked to move in. Now, here is where I have to be honest with myself, because I've had a lot of time to think about this and I've made my peace with my part in it. The reason I said yes was not purely generosity. Some of it was loneliness. The house was quiet in a way it had never been quiet when Curtis was alive. He was a loud man in the best sense, always had the news on, always had an opinion about something, always wanted to know what I was thinking about. After he died, the silence in this house had weight. It pressed on you. And when my son called and said they were having trouble with the rent, that the landlord had raised it again and they just needed a few months to save up, I said yes because I wanted someone in the house. That was my first mistake. Not saying yes, I believe in helping family. My mistake was not saying yes with conditions. Not sitting them down and saying, here are the rules, here is the timeline, here is the exit date. I just said, yes, come on, we'll figure it out. And you cannot say that to certain kinds of people, because certain kinds of people here will figure it out, and they think it means forever. They moved in on a Friday in October with 17 boxes and a sectional sofa that did not fit through the front door and had to go in through the back. I remember standing in my living room watching them rearrange my furniture to fit their sectional and thinking it would be fine. It would all be fine. They just needed a few months. The first sign was small. They always are. About 3 weeks in, Simone asked me if I thought about updating the kitchen. She said it with a particular kind of brightness, the kind that means the person has been thinking about it for a while and has just been waiting for the right moment to bring it up. I told her the kitchen was fine. Curtis and I had redone it in 2015, new countertops, new backsplash, the whole thing. She said, "Oh, of course. It's just, granite is a little dated now, isn't it? Quartz is really what everyone's doing." I said I liked granite. She smiled and said, "Of course you do," and went back to the living room. I stood in my kitchen for a moment after that. Just stood there. And then I went to my bedroom and I opened the small notebook I keep in my nightstand drawer, the one Curtis gave me years ago, brown leather, my initials on the cover. And I wrote down the date and what she said. Not because I knew at the time what I was doing. More like an instinct, like something in me said, keep track of this. I kept that notebook for 2 years. By the time everything came to a head, I had filled it almost completely. Over the following months, the comments accumulated. My wardrobe was classic. She said it like a consolation prize. The photos of Curtis on the mantle were a lot of photos for one person. The car I drove, a 28 Buick LeSabre that ran perfectly fine, was interesting. Another word she used like a weapon. She asked me once, in front of both of them at dinner, whether I'd considered downsizing to a smaller place now that I was alone. As if I were alone. As if they weren't sitting at my table eating food I had cooked. Dwayne never said anything. That was the part that took the longest to accept. He would sit right there and let it happen, and then later, privately, he'd say things like, "She doesn't mean it that way," or, "You know how Simone is, like her behavior was a weather pattern, something beyond anyone's control, certainly not his." The shift in the house was gradual and then sudden. Gradual for about a year and a half. And then one Tuesday morning, Simone told me she'd rescheduled my dentist appointment because she'd booked the car for a thing she had. She said it casually, standing at the counter eating a yogurt. "Oh, by the way, I moved your appointment. The confirmation should be in your email." I looked at her. "How did you access my calendar? We share the family calendar, remember? You added me months ago." She smiled. "I just figured it would be easier." I went to my room. I called Rosalie. I said, "I think something is very wrong." Rosalie said, "I told you at the engagement dinner." I started paying closer attention after that. And what I found, when I started paying closer attention, was worse than I'd imagined. My utilities had gone up $300 a month. I'd assumed it was the rate increase. The electric company had sent a notice. But when I actually looked at the bills, the usage had nearly doubled. They ran the heat at 78 degrees in winter. They had a second television I hadn't noticed in the guest room, streaming something 24 hours a day. The water bill had jumped because Simone took 40-minute showers. I know because I started keeping track. My grocery bill was another thing. I'd always done the shopping, and I'd always cooked most nights. But at some point, that had quietly become me shopping for 4 people. Simone's brother visited frequently, sometimes for a week at a time, sleeping on that sectional, without any conversation about contribution. I looked back through my bank statements one afternoon, something I hadn't done in months, because looking at numbers after Curtis died made me feel his absence in a physical way, and I sat there at my kitchen table with 6 months of statements, and I added it up. In 8 months, I had spent approximately $4,000 on groceries for my household. Before they moved in, I spent about $400 a month. I was now spending nearly double that, and no one had ever offered me a dime. I want to be careful not to make this about money, because it wasn't only about money. It was about what the money represented. It was about sitting in my own kitchen at 7 in the morning with my coffee and having Simone walk in and immediately begin rearranging the mugs because she'd decided on a new organizational system. It was about coming home from my Tuesday afternoon book club, the one thing I did purely for myself, and finding that she had rearranged my living room, moved Curtis's reading chair to the corner because it threw off the flow. I moved it back. She moved it forward again 2 days later. We did this 4 times before I stopped moving it and just looked at the corner where it sat and felt something harden in my chest. The evening I found his Purple Heart in a box in the garage was the night everything changed in my mind, even if it took a little longer to change in practice. Curtis had served 2 years in the Army before he became an engineer. He didn't talk about it often. The Purple Heart sat on the bookshelf in the den, in a small wooden display case he'd made himself. It had been there for 30 years. I walked into the garage to get the extra folding chairs for a small birthday dinner I was having for Rosalie, and there it was, sitting in a cardboard box, nestled between an old extension cord and a decorative wreath we hadn't hung in years. I stood in the garage for a long time. Then I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table, and I did not cry, because I had passed the point of crying. I opened my notebook, I wrote down the date, I wrote, "Purple Heart moved to garage," and then I made myself a sandwich, and I called my accountant the next morning. Her name was Judith. She'd been managing my finances since Curtis passed, and she was the kind of woman who made you feel steadier just by being in the room. I sat across from her desk and I laid it out plainly, what was coming in, what was going out, what the last 24 months had cost me in real and practical terms. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Lucille," she said, "do they pay you any rent?" "No." "Have they ever offered?" "My son mentioned it once in the beginning. He said they'd get situated and then work something out." Judith looked at her notes. "You own the house outright?" "Yes." "And your retirement accounts? The 401k? The pension from Curtis's employer? Those are intact?" "Yes. I haven't touched them." She nodded slowly. "Good." She looked at me directly. "You know what you need to do. I know, I said. I just needed to hear the numbers. We talked for another hour about specifics, about what documentation I had, about what my rights were as a homeowner in this state, about the notice period required to ask someone to vacate a property even when there is no formal lease. 30 days in our state, which I found both surprisingly reasonable and surprisingly inadequate given what I'd been living with. She connected me with her brother-in-law, who was a real estate attorney, and I met with him the following week. His name was Gerald, and he had a quiet thoroughness about him that reminded me of Curtis. He reviewed my notebook. Yes, I brought the notebook. 2 years of dates and incidents and exact quotes, and he told me I had more documentation than most people think to keep. He said, "You did the right thing writing it down." I told him my husband's instincts had stayed with me even after he was gone. He said that was a good kind of haunting to have. We set a date. I chose a Friday, which I want to say was strategic, but was actually just when Gerald had availability for a follow-up call. I spent the week before it feeling something that took me a while to name. Not fear, not anger, something more like clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you've been looking at something sideways for so long that finally looking at it straight feels almost like relief. The Thursday night before, Simone and Dwayne went out to dinner. They didn't invite me, which was fine. They came home late laughing about something, and I lay in my bed and listened to them moving around downstairs, and I thought about Curtis. I thought about the Saturday mornings we used to sit at that kitchen table together with the paper and not talk much and not need to. I thought about how he would have handled this, and I decided he would have been slower to act, and I had made peace with that difference between us. Friday morning, they slept in. I was up at 6, dressed by 6:30, coffee made by 7. At 8:30, I heard Simone's footsteps on the stairs. She had a particular way of coming downstairs that always sounded like she owned the place. And I suppose by that point she'd been acting like she did for long enough that she'd forgotten she didn't. She came into the kitchen and reached past me for the coffee carafe without saying good morning. I said, "Simone, I need to speak with you and Dwayne. Can you get him, please?" She looked at me sideways. "He's still sleeping. Wake him up." Something in my voice must have landed differently than usual, because she put down the carafe and went back upstairs without another word. They came down together, Dwayne in a t-shirt, looking confused and young in a way that made something ache in me even then. I had a folder on the table. Gerald had helped me prepare it. Inside was a formally written notice of termination of occupancy, 30 days, starting today, along with a document itemizing every month of expenses I'd absorbed on their behalf over the course of their stay, utilities, groceries, incidentals, the dental appointment I'd had to reschedule and pay a cancellation fee on. The total was not small. I slid the folder across the table. Dwayne looked at it and then looked at me. "Mom, what is this?" "It's a notice," I said. "You have 30 days. I've noted the total amount that your stay has cost this household. I'm not asking you to repay it. I'm showing it to you so that it's documented and so that we're all clear about what has happened here." Simone picked up the papers. She flipped through them. Her expression changed slowly, like a mask dissolving from the inside. You were tracking all of this?" "Since the beginning," I said. "Almost. This is." She turned to Dwayne. "Are you going to say something?" Dwayne was looking at the table. "Dwayne," I said, and I kept my voice even. "I love you. I will always love you. But this is my house. It has been my house for 37 years. Your father and I built our life here, and I will not spend whatever time I have left feeling like a guest in my own kitchen." I paused. "You are my son. That is not negotiable, but this arrangement is finished." He didn't say much. Simone said quite a bit, most of which I won't repeat, including something about my stubbornness and something about toxic family dynamics. And at one point she used the phrase gaslighting in a way that suggested she had recently learned the word and was still working out the applications. I sat through it. I didn't raise my voice. When she had finished, I said, "The 30 days begins today. I'll give you privacy to make your plans." Then I picked up my coffee, went out to the back porch, and sat down in the same chair I'd been sitting in when Dwayne called from the hotel. It was a cool morning. The birds were starting up in the big oak at the back of the yard. Curtis planted that tree in 1994 from a seedling, and it was enormous now, spreading out over half the yard, and in the fall it dropped enough leaves to bury a car. I'd always said it was too big. Now I sat under it and was glad it was exactly the size it was. I want to tell you about the call from the attorney, because it matters. 5 days after I delivered the notice, Gerald called me to let me know he'd received contact from Simone's family. Apparently, she had spoken to her cousin, who had some involvement in property law, and there had been questions raised about tenants' rights given the length of their stay. I want to be honest. For about 20 minutes, when Gerald first explained this, I felt something cold move through me. The possibility that my own home could become a legal matter. And then Gerald told me about the notebook. He said the documentation I had, the specificity of it, the dates, the exact language, the consistency put me in an exceptionally strong position. He said, most people don't keep records. You kept records. He also told me that because there had never been a lease, never any formal agreement, the situation was straightforward from a legal standpoint. They were guests. And guests, even long-term ones, do not have the same protections as tenants in a formal rental arrangement. Within 2 weeks, Simone's cousin stopped calling. They were gone in 26 days, 4 days before the 30-day deadline. I came home from Rosalie's one Sunday afternoon, and their cars were not in the driveway, and the sectional was gone, and the house was quiet. I walked through every room. The guest room where they'd stayed smelled like Simone's perfume, and I opened the windows and let the October air move through. I found a few things left behind. A charging cable, a cookbook she'd bought at some point, a photograph that had slipped behind the dresser, one of Dwayne from what looked like college, grinning, young. I set it on the kitchen counter. I put Curtis's Purple Heart back on the bookshelf in the den. I stood there in front of it for a moment, touched the edge of the display case. Then I went to the kitchen and made myself a proper dinner, just for one, and I ate at the table with the news on low in the background the way Curtis always used to have it. My son called me 6 weeks later. It was a Sunday, mid-morning. He said he was sorry. He didn't use those exact words. He said things like, I should have done better, and I know it got out of hand, and I think I let her drive a lot of the decisions, but the shape of it was an apology, and I received it as one. I told him he was still my son. I told him I would always pick up his call. I told him that if he ever needed real help, the kind that doesn't cost $11,000 a night, my door was open. But I also told him that open doors have frames, that there are edges to things, even with people you love, and the edges matter. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I found the chair, Mom, in the corner. I didn't know she'd moved it. I didn't say anything to that. Some things don't need a response. We talk most Sundays now. It's tentative still, the way a plant looks when it's been repotted and hasn't quite decided if it's going to take. But it's something. I'll take something. Rosalie came over for dinner last month. She brought wine, and I made pot roast, and we sat at that kitchen table until almost 11 o'clock, which neither of us had done in years because we are 63 and 67 respectively, and 10 o'clock used to feel late. We talked about everything and nothing, and at some point she looked around the kitchen and said, It feels like your house again. I said, It always was. She said, You know what I mean. And I did. I knew exactly what she meant. There is something that happens to a space when other people live in it too long on their own terms. Something shifts. The house starts to feel like it's waiting to find out who it belongs to. And when it's yours again, really yours, in the quiet, ordinary way that means you can leave your coffee cup on the counter and watch the news too loud and go to bed without explaining yourself to anyone, it feels like breathing out. I am 63 years old. I have been a wife, a mother, a widow. I have worked and saved and held this family together through things I don't need to list out because you already know what grief and time and the ordinary business of living costs a person. I know now what I wish I had known 2 years ago, That loving someone does not mean dissolving yourself into their comfort. That generosity without boundaries is not generosity. It's an invitation. That the most important word I could have said and still can say and will say again if I need to is simply, "This is my home." It was always my home. I just had to remember it. I've thought a lot about what I would tell a younger version of myself if I ever had the chance. Not the Lucille in her 30s with a toddler on her hip and groceries in both arms. Not even the Lucille at 50 who thought she had figured most of it out. I mean the Lucille sitting at that kitchen table at 2 in the morning, phone in hand, her son's voice on the other end asking for $11,000, like it was a reasonable thing to ask at that hour or any hour. I would tell her, the call you're about to hang up is the most important thing you will do this year. Not because of the money, because of what saying no, clearly, finally, without apology, costs you, and what it gives back. Here's what I've come to understand about cause and effect. The real kind. The kind that has nothing to do with luck or fate or anything beyond what people choose and what those choices build over time. Dwayne didn't end up stranded at a luxury hotel by accident. Simone didn't move Curtis's Purple Heart to a garage box by accident. Those things happened because I had spent 2 years communicating, through my silence and my patience and my willingness to absorb the cost of their comfort, that there were no real consequences to treating me that way. I taught them what they could get away with, not intentionally. But the lesson landed all the same, and the reversal, the moment things actually changed, didn't come from anger. It came from clarity, from sitting down with my accountant Judith and looking at real numbers, from opening that notebook and reading my own handwriting, dates and incidents going back 24 months, and recognizing that I had been paying attention all along, even when I told myself I wasn't. Intelligence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the habit of writing things down. Sometimes it's knowing when the information you've been collecting is finally enough. What Simone never understood about me, what I think Dwayne forgot somewhere along the way, is that quiet does not mean weak. I was quiet for a long time in that house. I let things go that I shouldn't have let go. But I was also watching and thinking and building something in that notebook that would matter when the time came. That's not passivity. That's patience with a purpose, which is a different thing entirely. The hardest part wasn't the notice. It wasn't the 30 days, or the phone call from Gerald about Simone's cousin making inquiries, or even coming home to an empty driveway and walking through rooms that smelled like someone else's life. The hardest part was my son's face at that kitchen table. He looked young. He looked like he didn't fully understand what had happened to him or how he'd let it, and I had to sit with the fact that loving him completely did not mean I was obligated to keep paying for his confusion. That's the thing about self-respect. It's not something you declare once and have forever. It's something you practice. It's the decision you make at 2 in the morning to hang up the phone. It's the notebook you keep. It's the attorney you call. It's putting the Purple Heart back on the shelf where it belongs, and making yourself dinner and turning on the news, because this is your house, and it always was. I'm 63. I have more years behind me than I sometimes want to count, but I know this. The people who take from you will keep taking until the day you make taking cost something, and the people who love you, really love you, will still be there after you do. Dwayne calls on Sundays. We're figuring it out. That's enough.